As 1988, it was still considered a big deal that women were getting elected to the Canadian Parliament in any sizable number. During the 1970s, Canada had never elected more than 10 women to a parliament of over 300. 2. Campbell was from British Columbia. BC is a big and important province in this country, and Kim Campbell had some connection to the ruling establishment there. And 3. She was considered very politically moderate. Campbell had been part of the liberal wing of the Social Credit Party, and now she was very much part of the liberal wing of the Progressive Conservative Party too. So shortly after being re-elected, Prime Minister Mulroney was like, aha, this Kim Campbell person seems like real cabinet material. Checks a lot of boxes. In 1989, Prime Minister Mulroney made Kim Campbell Assistant Minister of Indian Affairs, and then in 1990 she got a big upgrade when she was made Attorney General of Canada. It was the very first time a woman had ever been made Attorney General. She even did this saucy photo shoot with a judge's robe to celebrate. So as I said, Kim Campbell was very much on the progressive end of the Progressive Conservative Party. She was pro-choice and considered herself an ardent feminist, and was very determined to ensure that the Mulroney government would not be too right-wing. In her memoir, Time and Chance, Campbell basically takes credit for all of the liberal things that the Mulroney administration did during its time in power, including helping craft Canada's strict gun control laws, broadening Canada's anti-discrimination statutes to include protections for gays and lesbians, allowing gays and lesbians to serve openly in the Canadian military, and liberalizing Canada's abortion laws. Although that last part didn't wind up being that relevant because the Mulroney government's abortion reforms never wound up actually passing, and today Canada enjoys the even more liberal status quo of having no abortion laws at all. But that is another story. For various reasons we won't fully get into here, by the early 1990s, Prime Minister Mulroney had become incredibly unpopular. It was pretty clear from the polls that if he attempted to run for a third term, he would go down to massive defeat. So on February 24th, 1993, Mulroney announced that he would resign the prime ministership and that his party, the Progressive Conservatives, would install a new prime minister to contest the 1993 election. And Kim Campbell became the establishment favorite to replace him almost immediately. Not because she was necessarily the highest profile member of his administration, but rather because she wasn't. In contrast to all of Mulroney's other tired old cabinet ministers, Kim Campbell was still considered a relatively fresh and novel figure on the Canadian political scene. She was thus viewed as someone who could inject a jolt of life into this lagging, unpopular party. So she was very much the frontrunner for the job, but early on there was already starting to be some ominous omens. I will read you a little passage from this book here called Dynasties and Interludes, which, by the way, is a very, very good book on Canadian political history. As if to signal what was to come, Campbell ran a poor leadership campaign and frittered away her early lead. It became evident she was not fully informed about the way the party operated, and she had not developed a vision of what her prime ministership might achieve. Thus, instead of a coronation, Kim Campbell won the leadership on a close second ballot. It was also clear that little thought had been given to the post-convention period and to the election campaign that would shortly follow. Kim Campbell was inaugurated as Prime Minister of Canada on June 25th, 1993, but there was really no time for her to do anything with the job because it was already Canadian election time. Now, partially as a result of Brian Mulroney's incredible unpopularity, in the early 1990s, Canada was starting to develop some new political parties. These were founded by people that had previously supported the Progressive Conservative Party, but had now concluded that the whole party was basically a lost cause. In Western Canada, two right-wing guys named Preston Manning and Stephen Harper created a new party called the Reform Party of Canada. It was basically a populist party for conservative voters who had grown disillusioned with wishy-washy progressive conservative politicians like, well, Kim Campbell. And then in Quebec, a guy named Lucien Bouchard, who had previously worked for the Mulroney administration, created a new party called the Bloc Québécois, devoted to Quebec separatism. His argument was that Mulroney had betrayed Quebec so badly, there was basically no reason to even try to make things work in Canada anymore. Now, a lot of people would argue that the emergence of these new parties basically guaranteed that Canada would experience a lot of vote splitting in the 1993 election, which means that it's not really Kim Campbell's fault that she lost as badly as she did. But even if that is indeed the case, Kim Campbell herself certainly didn't make things much better. I will try to be delicate about this, but basically, Kim Campbell was not a good campaigner, nor was she terribly likable. She had a sort of condescending personality and was often characterized as being sort of broadly out of touch with a lot of the anger and pain that voters across the country were feeling at that time. For example, Canada in the 1990s was in the midst of a rather severe recession with unemployment over 10%, and Campbell was asked about it once, and she gave this very aloof answer that wound up being one of the defining moments of the campaign.
And I would like to see, certainly, by the turn of the century, a country where unemployment is way down, and where we're paying down our national debt, and there's a whole new vision of the future opening up for Canadians. But it requires us to use the resources that we have, and the first thing that we have to do is recognize what extraordinary resources we have as a country.
And then there was this other gaffe, still very widely remembered today, when a reporter was trying to ask her for specifics about something, and Campbell sort of snobbily responded that an election is no time to discuss serious issues. Now, in fairness to Campbell, that comment was taken out of context, but it nevertheless helped reinforce a dominant image that a lot of people had of her. And then there was the face ad. So Campbell's main opponent, at least in her own mind, was the leader of the Liberal Party, Jean Chrétien. Chrétien had this very particular way of talking, partially because he had a very thick French-Canadian accent, and partially because he had this facial deformity that paralyzed part of his mouth.
And you will understand that we can be different, but we can be proud Francophone and be proud Canadian at the same time.
Anyway, the Campbell campaign ran this ad.
Is this a prime minister? Does he understand that his plan to allow a deficit each year would increase our debt? How can he believe that you can kickstart a modern economy by fixing some roads? Why doesn't he answer the questions he's asked? Doesn't he understand the questions? Or the answers? Or both? Jean Chrétien, a prime minister? Think twice.
A lot of people thought this was very offensive, but it was also a major strategic blunder in that it gave Chrétien an opportunity to deliver the political zinger that he had been clearly waiting his entire life to give.
God gave me a physical defect. And I've accepted that since I'm a kid. It's true that I speak on one side of my mouth. I'm not a Tory, I don't speak on both sides of my mouth.
But apart from all of the gaffes, in a bigger sense, Campbell's campaign was doomed by the fact that she really had no obvious base. The right hated her, the left hated her, Quebec hated her, and by the end, the media really hated her. As a result, when voting day finally came, the Progressive Conservative Party went down to the biggest electoral defeat in Canadian history. Campbell's party, which had won 169 seats under Brian Mulroney in the last election, plummeted to 2. Yes, 2. The popular vote was a little bit better. She went from 43% to 16%. So, only a 27-point drop. Prime Minister Campbell even lost her own seat, which is a pretty remarkable thing to happen in a parliamentary system, given that the Prime Minister's seat is supposed to be like in the safest of safe areas. The disastrous nature of Kim Campbell's 1993 loss cast a long shadow on Canadian politics that we're still sort of dealing with the aftermath of. For one, it basically permanently destroyed her party, the Progressive Conservative Party, and allowed the Reform Party to displace it as like the dominant party of the Canadian centre-right. After trudging along in zombified form for a few more years, in 2004, the Progressive Conservative Party officially merged with the Reform Party, which was then led by future Prime Minister Stephen Harper. This represented a major victory for Harper and people like him who had wanted Canada to have a more aggressive and ideological Conservative Party. As I mentioned, only 2 Progressive Conservatives were able to hang on to seats in Parliament in the 1993 election. This wound up doing good things for their political careers out of sheer process of elimination. One of the 2, Jean Charest, became the new head of the party, and he deserves some credit for keeping the Progressive Conservatives on life support for the next decade. In 1998, Charest left national politics, and in 2003, he was elected Prime Minister of Quebec. He only left office in 2012. But perhaps the most surprising success story was Kim Campbell's former campaign manager, John Tory. He has somehow managed to remain a viable figure in Canadian politics, despite, presiding over the worst defeat in Canadian history. After serving as stint as head of the Ontario Conservative Party. In 2014, he was elected mayor of Toronto, a job he holds to this day. But what, you ask, became of Kim Campbell herself? Shortly after her defeat, new Prime Minister Jean Chrétien took pity on her and appointed her to a diplomatic post. Not something good like an ambassador, mind you. She was just made an adjunct diplomat at the Canadian consulate in Los Angeles. And when that ran its course, she needed to figure out something else to do with herself. She hadn't been in politics long enough to qualify for a pension. And in the end, basically what she decided to do was just milk her